Did you ever wonder why, in recent years, more and more people seem to be disappearing from our national parks, and at such a higher rate than ever before? While many see these occurrences as unexplainable or seem to think they have a reasonable, rational, or even scientific explanation for it all, there are some of us who know better, some of us who think otherwise. From UFO and Bigfoot sightings to the bizarre and unexplained missing 411 clusters, many of us are left scratching our heads and wondering what is going on out there in the woods. While there are many folk tales and legends into who or what is lurking out there in the woods and forests all around the world, today we're going to focus on one legend in particular, the legend of the FAE or fairy people. While most people seem to think of them as helpful, beautiful, and sparkly, if not a little bit mischievous, when thinking of fairies, there are others who have heard the real legends, the real terrifying and strange encounters with these mystical beings in the woods, and have had our visions of them forever changed because of it. Let's take a walk through the deepest, darkest parts of the forest and explain the shockingly terrifying world of the Fae. Could they be the real reason all these hikers and hunters and professionals, children and animals too, have gone missing at such an alarming rate all over the world? It's up to you to decide. Wherever you travel in the world, there's some kind of fairy legend. They differ from place to place, and quite unusually, there seems to be no single point of origin from where they came from or where the story started. In many cultures, it's believed that these tiny beings are actually demoted angels or even demons who lurk and hide in the woods and forest, ready to snatch unsuspecting victims out of our known place and time, dragging them to who knows where. There's also a strong belief for the need to ward them off using charms of protection, usually worn somewhere on the body. If you ever run into one of these beings, be sure not to mention it by name. More commonly, they are referred to as the little people or the hidden people, so as not to summon them unknowingly. So, the people who believe this legend of the fairies or the fae being fallen, whether angel or otherwise, believe they are neither good enough for heaven nor bad enough for hell below. They can appear and disappear at will, which makes it very easy for them to stalk and sneak up on their target. In 1962, in southern England, a farmer's wife reported getting lost in a very remote area of wilderness known to this day as the Berkshire Downs. She recalls how she didn't even realize she was losing her way and became very panicked and confused all of a sudden. She claims to have never switched course and headed the entire time in the same and correct direction towards where she originally intended to go. What she realized later on, though, was that she was actually moving further and further into more remote and desolate parts of the woods, away from any other form of civilization. Eventually, she got very tired and stopped for a few minutes. This is when she heard a sort of murmuring or mumbling coming from somewhere near her, although exactly where she couldn't be sure, as even though it was a clear and sunny day, she couldn't see anyone or anything to accompany the strange voice. Suddenly, as she sat there confused and trying to find the source of the small voice she thought she was hearing, a little person stepped out of the shadows of the woods and directly into her path. The bizarre thing here, though, the figure she describes as most likely male and dressed all in green appeared behind her, though somehow she claims she could see him and knew for a fact he was there. Without saying a word, the little man turned her around and pointed her to the right path back to her home. The figure then disappeared without a trace right before her eyes, and it was only while talking to her husband later on and recounting her bizarre and seemingly stress-induced experience did she realize she had encountered one of the Fae. Lucky for her, this was one of the helpful ones, and not the more commonly known ones who purposefully lure unsuspecting wanderers off their track and bring them to places unknown, where they will never be able to find their way back. In Celtic lore, the FAE, or Little People, are said to live underground, and any travelers who either knowingly or unknowingly trespass too near these hidden places are said to go missing and are never seen or heard from again. Many people who have had an encounter have reported to being in a place they had never seen or knew existed before, seemingly in the blink of an eye, with no knowledge or recollection of how they got there. Although this seemingly new place was definitely not where they were just a second ago, it still looked enough like where they had just been to make them question their own sanity. These places are familiar, yet unfamiliar, simply giving one an instinctual feeling that they are somewhere other. When they finally, and seemingly just as suddenly, return to where they had left from, always much more time has passed than they had anticipated. With what seemed to be like mere minutes had actually been hours or even days in some cases. Now, let's go to the United States and explore the early Native American legends of Mount Shasta. There were many complaints of even the earliest native settlers on and near this particular mountain of members of their tribe, specifically their hunting parties, who would vanish without a trace, never to be seen or heard from again. This happened so often, in fact, they started to believe the whole area was cursed. They also spoke of a bright stone which traversed the mountain and seemingly swallowed people whole. They were convinced that this stone had something to do with the fairies. Do you believe this area could be cursed? What was this glowing stone? Do you believe that stone has the ability to open up, swallow someone, and close back? Or do you believe this was just a scary story to tell their children in the hopes of keeping them from wandering too far on the mountain alone? On the other side of the world, in northern Sweden, there's a man who, for the sake of this video and out of respect for his desire to remain anonymous, we'll call Joe. Throughout his childhood, Joe would go to his grandparents' house in a deeply wooded area with lots of trees and trails for a young boy to explore. When he was 10 years old, he and his family went to stay at his grandparents' house for the entire summer. Aside from the one main house, there were several smaller cabins on the property, which his grandparents owned, and his family would stay together in these series of cabins for the entirety of their summer vacation. Joe stayed with a group of his cousins in a cabin that was a little less than 100 feet away from his grandparents' main house. This was extremely desolate land, and the closest town was miles and miles away. There was also a lake on the property, and Joe and his cousin's cabin was the closest one to it as well. There's electricity, but no running water, and the family had to collect their own, as going to the nearest town to buy some wasn't a reasonable option, as it would have taken so long for them to get there and return. While the lake was directly in front of Joe's cabin, behind it were very deep, very dark, and very desolate woods. Joe's grandfather would tell many stories to the family about alleged encounters he had had while in those woods, encounters which he didn't know how to explain, as there seemed to be no known words to describe what he was seeing and or experiencing. Joe himself said whenever he was hiking or just wandering around these woods, he always got this sort of creepy and eerie feeling, which he could never shake nor never explain. On numerous occasions, Joe reported seeing little people who would appear and then vanish just as quickly and seemingly without a trace. He claims that when these little people would cross the dirt paths, anyone nearby would freeze in place until they had gone. Now, when his cousin heard Joe telling other family members these experiences he was having, he decided that on the next hike he took with Joe, he would bring it up to joke and possibly tease him about. Obviously, he wasn't a believer. The cousin laughed and pretended to freeze in place while telling Joe it seemed he had come across one of the little people's trails. The boy's grandfather, however, wasn't very happy about this joke and reprimanded the other boy not to ever joke about the little people, especially not while wandering in the woods. The subject was eventually dropped, and they all went home to their respective cabins to retire for the night. In the middle of the night, however, Joe recalls being awakened by some sort of noise outside the cabin. The noise seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, all around the cabin, instead of just one singular place. He likened the noise to bears scratching at the outside of the cabin. It also sounded simultaneously like pebbles or giant raindrops were falling down onto the roof and running down the sides of the cabin. Suddenly, the scratching sounds seemed to be coming from under Joe and his cousin's beds. They were frozen in fear, frozen in place, if you will, with terror from the sound coming from right under where they were each respectively sitting. Eventually, they summoned the courage to get up and run as fast as they could to their grandparents' cabin to tell them what was going on. The next day, the two boys and their grandfather walked the same path in the woods as the day before, where their cousin had made the insult towards the little people, and they scattered candy all around and along the trails. As they did this, they profusely apologized for offending whatever it was in those woods that day and night. Joe thinks it was definitely the little people who had come to teach him and his cousin a lesson on manners and respect. Back in the United States in March of 1886, an Ohio newspaper article in the Bloomington Daily Leader came out involving a man and his daughter. This incident took place years before the article had come out, and the daughter's name is still unknown, while the man's name is Andy. We will call his daughter Sarah for the purpose of this story. Andy and Sarah were living in Dubuque County at the time. According to Andy, in her early teen years, his daughter started becoming sickly and ill all the time, and none of the doctors who examined or treated her seemed to be of any help. Whatever the illness was, it always seemed to return almost as quickly as it would leave. Because none of the physicians seemed to be able to figure out what was ailing her or how to cure it, Andy decided to take his daughter to a monastery and see a man named Father Bernard. Father Bernard was very well respected and considered very wise throughout the community, and upon hearing about Sarah's unexplainable illness, agreed to pray with the young girl. During one of their walks home from praying with Father Bernard, Sarah allegedly turned to her father and told him that it was all useless, that everything Father Bernard was doing wasn't going to help her, and eventually she would be taken by the FAE. Andy didn't pay attention at the time and thought his daughter was just feeling discouraged as she'd been sick for so long. About a year after she said this to him about the fairies, Sarah went missing. She seemed to have left everything behind and disappeared with only the clothes on her back. Searchers almost immediately dragged the creeks in the area and conducted foot searches deep into the neighboring woods for miles and miles, but no one ever found a single trace of Sarah. Because of the lack of any sign of her or evidence as to where she had gone, the locals and law enforcement set their sights on Andy as the culprit who had done something to his own daughter. However, luckily, before any charges were pressed against him, Sarah returned. The story she told as to what happened to her was unbelievable to most, and it's for you to decide now if you believe it or not. Sarah claimed that she had simply been traveling the country with the fairies the entire time she was gone. She recounted being in strange vehicles, invisible to the naked eye. The third day of her return, Sarah informed everyone that the FAE would soon be back for her, and she would have to leave again with them. Indubitably, she left again not long after, and was never seen or heard from again. The newspaper reported that Andy never changed his story about what had happened to his daughter, and when asked what he believed, he responded with the tales of the fairies from Ireland. Now, if you're thinking all of this talk of real fairies and the fae folk has started perhaps with the modern-day versions of fairy tales and people letting their imagination run wild, then maybe think again. Here's another story that takes place all the way back in the 16th century. This is an account of what allegedly happened to a woman named Anne Jeffries. Anne was born in 1626 and passed away in 1698. There was a wealthy neighboring family named the Pitts who employed Anne as a domestic servant and were able and willing to verify all of Anne's accounts and claimed witness to some as well. Now let's travel back in time and hear the remarkable stories of Anne's encounters. Now, the documentation of these encounters came from a man named Moses Pitt, who wrote it all down and sent it to one Reverend Dr. Edward Fowler, who was the Bishop of Gloucester at the time of the strange occurrences. Moses was seeking the Reverend's advice on the matter. Let's hear what he has to say. In 1645, when Anne was just 19 years old, is when the unusual experiences are said to have started. Anne secured a job as a domestic servant for the wealthy Pitt family and started working in their home. While it's unclear exactly how long she'd been working for them at the time of this first encounter, we know it wasn't very long after she started. One morning, after Anne had finished up all her household chores, she went outside and sat in the garden of the huge estate home. Anne claims that, while sitting there silently, taking in the nice weather and relaxing on the comfortable arbor there in the backyard of that home, she heard someone or something in the woods very close to her. She said it sounded like someone was walking, very lightly, towards her. She first thought maybe it was one of the family members or maybe just a visitor to the home. She quickly disregarded this thought, however, when she began to hear strange ringing sounds, seemingly coming from every direction around her all at once. Although scared, Anne recalled that the day was so bright and beautiful, she also felt as though nothing could harm her. Also, she reasoned, there were people all around her, in the front of the house and inside as well, many witnesses, if you will. While the ringing was still going on, very loudly, and while Anne was trying to get her bearings, 6 small men, dressed all in green, suddenly appeared out of nowhere from the bright and sunny woods nearby. She described them as cute and charming looking, with big eyes and tiny little legs. She later started referring to them as fairies. Now, there's no information as to what made her use this particular title for a description, or what made her think this is what these little men in green were. Anne also claimed that upon laying her eyes on the men, she had become paralyzed or frozen in place, and after a minute or two she noticed a slight change in her environment before it changed altogether, and she saw the little men had brought her to what she called a castle in the sky. It is here where Anne claimed that these men had relations with her. The Pitt family verified that Anne did in fact go missing for that entire day, and though they searched far and wide, they never could locate her. Anne reappeared on her own, though, groggy, laying disheveled and in the fetal position on the lawn in the front yard. Anne kept quiet about her encounter for fear of being called insane or possibly even losing her job. However, she started speaking out and telling people her tale when she claims the little men, or fairies, started to return to her on occasion. This became her torment, and she started opening up to one member of the Pitt family about her ordeal. Unfortunately for Anne, she placed her trust in the wrong family member, because shortly after confessing what was troubling her, recounting her tale of little men dressed in green doing those things to her in a castle in the sky, this person reported her to the local authorities, and in short order, Anne was arrested and charged with witchcraft. She was even sent to jail for it. A piece of mail, written by the mayor of this small town where all this is said to have occurred, has been kept and preserved throughout history and can now be found in the Clarendon Manuscripts Archives. This document not only contains verification that Anne was held for quite some time in the jail, there's also a small portion that seems to back up her claim that the little men were in fact still coming to visit. It states how, despite being starved for several months, Anne never got sick and didn't ever seem to be starving or even hungry, as though someone were bringing her food regularly. Anne herself later confirmed this suspicion by telling Moses Pitt how the fairies did in fact feed her by bringing her unusual bread. However, the explanation as to what exactly she meant by unusual bread is either lost in time or never was. Obviously, this could have been very helpful to proving her innocence of not practicing witchcraft, especially back in the late 1600s. For whatever reason, Anne was eventually released from prison and the charges against her were dropped. She moved on with her life and eventually married a laborer named William Warren. She would later state, when pursuing a new career in nursing, that she wasn't sure how or why it had happened, why they had chosen her, but that the fairies had given her a wealth of knowledge in the medical and nursing fields. and she wanted desperately to use it to help others. And she eventually did become a nurse. In 1693, Moses Pitt, who had remained friends with Anne, though after she was accused in jail for witchcraft he did so in secret, decided to send a journalist friend of his named Humphrey Martin to interview Anne about all of her strange encounters and dealings with these little men dressed all in green. However, at that point, Anne didn't want to talk about it anymore for fear of what might happen to her if word got out again. She was quite comfortable and happy in her married life to William and her nursing career, and didn't care to revisit the alleged torment she went through, not only in jail, but in the Sky Castle. Humphrey Martin wrote to Moses Pitt in response saying, "As for Anne Jeffreys, I have been with her the greater part of one day, and did read to her all that you wrote to me, but she would not own anything of it. As concerning the fairies or any of the cures that she could perform, I asked her the reason why she would not do it. She replied that if she would discover it to you, that you would make books and ballads of it, and she said that she would not have her name spread about the country in books and ballads of such thing." Now, at the time all this was happening with Anne, in the mid to late 17th century, the belief in fairies was very widespread and actually quite common, though almost always kept in secret for fear of being jailed and labeled a witch, like Anne. There were many reports of similar things happening to many different people all over the world. These castle-in-the-sky encounters were the most common. While this is almost always related to a totally different type of abduction nowadays, it was always related to the FAE then. Continuing, I think it would be completely remiss of us to be speaking of the fairies and not mention the origin of fairy tales. Now, according to Wikipedia, the oral tradition of the fairy tale came along before the written page. Tales were told, retold, and enacted dramatically, whether about fairies or not. These tales were then told and passed down from generation to generation. Mystical and magical happenings and beings seem to be more a part of the fairy tale itself than actual fairies being included in such stories. The first written collections which attempted to preserve not only the theme and characters told in such tales were by the Brothers Grimm. While they had to later rewrite all the tales to make them more acceptable and also more profitable, due to the original content having mostly sexual overtones and not being child-friendly at all, any kind of talking animal, grotesque goblin, troll, beast, or monster can be considered a fairy tale. Also, tales of warning, meant to keep young children in line by telling of strange and horrible and unfortunate things that have allegedly happened to other children who, for instance, didn't eat their vegetables or clean their rooms. Those kids who didn't brush their teeth and told lies. There's always a lesson to be learned in these tales. Take them for what they're worth to you. While this is just the beginning of the vast information about a few different tales and legends of fairies, we've only begun to scratch the surface. Now, I'll leave you with some lesser-known information that may be helpful should you ever encounter one or maybe even a few of these little people. Know that, while the above stories seem to show a more benevolent side to these fairy legends, which in modern times have been Disneyfied, they are often known to be much more evil and complicated to pin down from one country to another in real life. However, most state that these creatures are master manipulators, and should you come across them, never, under any circumstances, enter into any kind of deal or arrangement with them. Again, they are considered to be master manipulators and also masters of language, and can find loopholes and use linguistic trickery to fool you into dealing with them for you to only too late realize you don't stand a chance at getting what you want or supposed to get, and yet the Fae get everything they are supposed to out of the deal. They will always benefit, mostly at the detriment of the other person. As they say in Vegas, the house always wins. Here are a few rules of engagement when it comes to these mystical beings. Never insult them and always be polite. Try your very best not to anger them, as this is how most people end up disappearing. If you ever get the feeling you're being watched by something invisible or get a sudden feeling you're not supposed to be where you are, turn around and leave immediately. Now, they do love presents and gifts. However, choose what you leave for them very carefully, as if whatever it is isn't sweet, your positive gesture can quickly turn into a negative experience. Think hard candy or other sugary sweets. Also, never use the words thank you or I'm sorry. For some reason, it is only acceptable to state pardon me and I appreciate that. The fairies have been known to sometimes speak in riddles, and there's almost always some kind of hidden meaning underneath what they're saying, so pay close attention and listen carefully. For instance, as one commenter on another video pointed out, I'm sorry admits fault, while pardon me simply asks for forgiveness. Also, thank you will put you in their debt, whereas I appreciate that simply expresses gratitude. Now, what do you think of all these encounters? Every culture since time immemorial has had these stories of the Fae or the fairy folk, including the Native Americans in Appalachia where I'm from. Do you believe these people exist? Do you believe that they are who cause people to disappear in the woods and forests and never to return? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. If you've had an encounter with the little people, we'd love to hear about it. Send an email to NationalParkMysteriesYT@gmail.com. Until we meet again, I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time.